Hello, friends, and welcome to my midweek meditation. We are in the book of Revelation, and last week we finished chapter 12. Now, instead of entering chapter 13, today I want to explain to you a time period we have seen in chapters 11 and 12, and that we will also see in chapter 13. The time period is referred to in various ways. I'm going to put all of the passages on the screen so you can see what I'm talking about. In chapter 11, verse 2, the time period is referred to as 42 months. We are told that is how long the holy city will be trampled. In the next verse, verse 3, the time period is referred to as 1,260 days. That is how long the two witnesses will speak, which is symbolic for all Christian witness. Now, before we look at some more verses, stop and think about these two references to the time period. If you round a month to 30 days, then 42 months equals 1,260 days. So you can see the same time period is being referred to in two different ways. In chapter 12, verse 6, the time period is again referred to as 1,260 days. That is how long the woman is nourished in the wilderness. And next week, in chapter 13, verse 5, it will again be referred to as 42 months. That is how long a beast will blaspheme and exercise authority. Now, there is one other way the time period is referred to. We saw it last week in chapter 12. Do you remember what it is? I'll add it to the screen. In chapter 12, verse 14, it is referred to as a time, times, and half a time. That seems very different, doesn't it? But let's think about it. Let's say the word time equals 1 year. It makes sense that when you make the word plural, times, that equals 2 years. A time equals 1 year, times equals 2 years. Now, given that assumption, what would half a time equal? Answer, 6 months, or half a year. Now, if you add those up, that equals 3.5 years. Now, we all know there are 12 months in a year. Therefore, 3.5 years equals 42 months. And 42 months rounded at 30 days per month equals 1,260 days. It's all the same time period referred to in different ways. Now, once you understand that, the next question is, what does it refer to? Is this time period symbolic? Is it literal? If it is symbolic, what is it symbolic for? I will answer all of those questions by showing you some more passages. The first passage I want to take you to is 1 Kings chapter 16, verse 29 through chapter 19, verse 18. Now, that's a long passage, isn't it? So I'm not going to read to you the whole passage. I encourage you this week to read through it at some point. It's a great passage. I think you'll enjoy it. Right now, I'll summarize it for you. In 1 Kings chapter 16, verses 29 and 30, we read that Ahab began to reign in Israel. And notice what we are told about him. Verse 30 says, "And Ahab, the son of Omri, did evil in the sight of the Lord, more than all who were before him." Wow, that is quite the statement. There were some pretty evil kings before Ahab, but he was more evil. To make sure we don't miss that truth, it is repeated just a few verses later. Verse 33 says this, "And Ahab made an Asherah. Ahab did more to provoke the Lord, the God of Israel, to anger than all the kings of Israel who were before him." Not a nice leader. And you might remember that his wife was Jezebel. I want to read to you what one of my Bible dictionaries says about her. Easton's Bible Dictionary says concerning Jezebel, she is the first great instigator of persecution against the saints of God, guided by no principle, restrained by no fear of either God or man, passionate in her attachment to her heathen worship. She spared no pains to maintain idolatry around her in all its splendor. So, in the passage I'm showing you, we have the most evil king to arise in Israel, married to a wicked queen who persecuted the saints of God. Now, their reign was a terrible time for all the saints of God. I want to read to you a passage about that. 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 3 and 4 say this. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. And when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by fifties in a cave and fed them with bread and water. Obadiah hid the prophets of the Lord because it was a dangerous time to be a saint. But during that time, God was in control. God was protecting those whom he wanted to protect, and he used them as he wanted to use them. We see that in the prophet Elijah. Elijah was powerfully used by God during this time, and I want to show you something from his life. 1 Kings chapter 17, verse 1 says this. Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord the God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. Elijah prayed that it would not rain, and it didn't rain. Guess how long it didn't rain? We're given the answer in 2 New Testament passages. In Luke chapter 4, starting with verse 25, we hear Jesus say this, I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and a great famine came over all the land. And Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And James chapter 5, starting with verse 17, says this, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months, it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. Seeing that time period 2 times in the New Testament means it was well known. If I say to you, 40 days and 40 nights, what event comes to mind? The flood, right? Well, in the same way, the time period, 3.5 years, should instantly bring to mind Elijah and all that was going on when Elijah prayed for it not to rain. Namely, the saints of God were being persecuted, and God was protecting his saints and using them as he desired. And as we've already seen, the time period, 3.5 years, equals 42 months, which equals 1,260 days, which is referred to as a time, times, and half a time. So here's the deal. The time period is symbolic. It represents a time during which saints are persecuted, even martyred, but during which God is protecting his people and using them powerfully as he desires. What the book of Revelation is showing us is that the last days are such a time period. Now remember, the last days are all the days between the 2 advents of Jesus. During this time, the dragon, Satan, he is angry. Christians are being persecuted. Some are being killed. That's going to happen more and more. But God, during this time, is protecting his people and powerfully using them as He desires. This week, instead of asking you to meditate on a verse from the book of Revelation, I'm going to ask you to meditate on the passage from James chapter 5 I just read for us. I'll read it for us again and include another verse. Here's James chapter 5, starting in verse 16. The prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain, and for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. Notice that Elijah was a human being, just like you, just like me. He had no special power. What Elijah had was a heart for God and the power of prayer. Learn from Elijah. Live during these last days with trust in God, with a heart for God, turning to Him in prayer. I hope you have a great day tomorrow, giving thanks to God, and I hope you join me again next week.